She rode into town with nothing but a tired horse, the dust of a dozen territories on her clothes, and a question burning in her gut. Her name was Sarah Hayes, and the silver locket around her neck was the only thing she had left of a family she couldn't remember. The town was called Redemption Valley, but for most folks it was the last stop before they disappeared for good. Tumbleweeds bounced past storefronts with faded paint, like ghosts of forgotten dreams. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely tune through the cracked boards of the saloon. She was looking for her brother, Michael, the only family she had left. He'd sent her a letter 6 months ago, said he'd found a lead on their past. A real lead. Then, silence. Sarah pulled her horse to a halt in front of the general store. A few old-timers on the porch stopped rocking their chairs and just stared. Strangers weren't common here. Strangers who looked like they meant business were even rarer. She swung down from the saddle, her boots hitting the dusty street with a soft thud. Her eyes, the color of moss after a hard rain, scanned the town. It was a place that kept its secrets buried deep. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady. She was talking to an old man sweeping the boardwalk, who looked like he'd been part of the town since the first nail was hammered in. "I'm looking for my brother, Michael Hayes." The old man stopped sweeping. He squinted at her, his face a road map of wrinkles. "Hayes. Can't say I know the name." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "But if anyone passed through, Marshall Davidson would know. He's got a ledger for every soul that drifts through this valley." It was a start, a tiny flicker of hope in a sea of unknowns. She thanked the man and led her horse toward the marshal's office. It was a small, squat building made of thick timber, with bars on the windows that looked more like they were meant to keep things in than out. A faded sign creaked in the wind. Marshall T. Davidson. She tied her horse to the rail, took a deep breath, and knocked. A gruff voice answered from inside. "It's open." Marshall Tom Davidson was a man who looked like he'd been carved from old oak. He was in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a thick mustache that hid his mouth but couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. He sat behind a large desk cluttered with papers, a half-empty bottle of whiskey sitting next to a gleaming Colt revolver. He looked up as Sarah entered, his gaze sharp and assessing. He wasn't just looking at her, he was looking through her, trying to read the story of how she'd ended up here. "Marshall," she said, her voice firm. "My name is Sarah Hayes. I'm looking for my brother Michael. He came through about 6 months ago. Tall, brown hair, looking for ranch work." The marshal leaned back in his creaky chair, steepling his fingers. He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching until it was almost uncomfortable. It was a test. She'd seen it before. Men in power trying to see if she'd flinch. She didn't. Finally he spoke. "Hayes. Yeah, that name rings a bell." He opened a thick, leather-bound ledger on his desk, his finger tracing down a list of names. "Here he is, Michael Hayes, passed through in the spring." Sarah's heart leaped. It was the first real proof she'd had in months. He was here. He was real. "Do you know where he went?" The marshal nodded slowly. "Said he was heading out to the Blackwood Ranch. Big spread south of here. John Blackwood's always looking for hands." He closed the ledger and pushed it aside. His eyes met hers and his expression shifted. Something like pity flickered across his face. "I can give you directions. But miss, that was a long time ago. A man like your brother, a drifter, they don't tend to stay in one place for long." "It's the only lead I have," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Thank you, Marshal." She turned to leave, her hand on the doorknob when he called out to her. "Miss Hayes." She looked back. "You be careful out there," he said, his voice low. "The trail to the Blackwood place. It runs through Devil's Jaw. It's a treacherous pass. There are accidents. Rock slides are common this time of year." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Stick to the path. Don't wander. And watch your step." A chill crept down Sarah's spine. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like something more. Something heavier. "I will," she said, and stepped back out into the unforgiving sun. She bought some supplies at the general store, hardtack, jerky, and a full canteen, and the storekeeper gave her the same strange, pitying look the marshal had. It was as if everyone in this town knew something she didn't. The directions the marshal had given her were clear enough. Follow the main road south for 5 miles, then take the fork that leads up into the hills. The trail was marked, he'd said. Easy to follow. But as she rode, the landscape grew more desolate. The rolling hills gave way to jagged rocks and steep cliffs. The trail narrowed, twisting and turning like a wounded snake. This was Devil's Jaw. The name was fitting. The wind howled through the canyons, sounding like a mournful cry. On one side, a sheer rock face climbed toward the sky. On the other, a drop that would mean certain death. She saw the signs of rock slides everywhere. Piles of fresh, sharp-edged stones littered the path. It looked like the mountain itself was trying to shake off anyone who dared to cross it. Her mare grew skittish, its ears twitching at every gust of wind, every pebble that skittered down the cliff face. Sarah kept a firm hand on the reins, her own senses on high alert. The marshal's warning echoed in her mind. Accidents are common. Then she saw it. Up ahead, the path was completely blocked. A massive pile of rock and debris, easily 20 feet high, had cascaded down from the cliff, covering the trail from edge to edge. It wasn't an old rock slide. The dust was still settling in the air. This had happened recently, very recently, maybe within the last hour. Her blood ran cold. If she'd been just a little earlier, she would have been right under it. It wasn't just a random act of nature. It felt targeted. It felt like a warning, or worse, an attempt. She was trapped. She couldn't go forward, and turning back to town felt like admitting defeat. There had to be another way. She scanned the cliffs above, looking for any possible road around the blockage. And that's when she saw something else. A flash of metal high up on the ridge. Someone was watching her. She didn't wait to see who it was. She yanked her mare's reins, turning the horse around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She spurred the horse into a gallop, racing back the way she came, the sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. She didn't stop until Devil's Jaw was far behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her mind reeling. The marshal hadn't just warned her. He had sent her into a death trap. Why? She found a different path, a smaller, less traveled cattle trail that seemed to lead in the same general direction. It was slower going, forcing her to navigate through thick brush and rocky creek beds. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple by the time she saw it. The Blackwood Ranch. It was a sprawling property, nestled in a wide, grassy valley. But as she got closer, she saw the signs of decay. Fences were broken, gates hung crookedly on their hinges, and the barn roof was sagging in the middle. The main house was a large, two-story structure that might have been grand once, but now it looked haunted. Paint peeled from the walls like sunburnt skin, and several windows were boarded up. This wasn't a thriving ranch. This was a place holding on by a thread. As she rode into the main yard, a group of ranch hands stopped their work and turned to stare at her. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow. They looked as worn down as the ranch itself. One of them, a man who looked to be in his late 40s with kind, weary eyes, stepped forward. "You lost, miss." "I'm looking for John Blackwood," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And a man named Michael Hayes. I was told he worked here." The ranch hands exchanged nervous glances. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The man who had spoken, whose name she'd later learned was Pete, shuffled his feet in the dirt. "The boss is in the house," he said quietly. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "As for your brother, he worked here. For a time." The past tense hung in the air like a noose. Worked. Before she could ask what he meant, the front door of the main house creaked open. A man stepped out onto the porch, and the world seemed to shrink around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of iron-gray hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a deep, profound sadness that was walled off by a harsh, unyielding anger. This was a man who had been broken by life and had pieced himself back together with sharp edges. This was John Blackwood. "What do you want?" His voice was a low growl, the sound of rocks grinding together. It was the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed and was tired of being disappointed. Sarah dismounted, forcing herself to stand tall, to not be intimidated. Mr. Blackwood, my name is Sarah Hayes. I'm looking for my brother, Michael. The marshal in town said he came to work for you. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He descended the porch steps, his heavy boots thudding against the wood. He stopped just a few feet from her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. Your brother worked here for a couple of months, he said, his voice clipped and final. He took his pay and left. Happened in the spring. Didn't say where he was headed. It was a lie. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. It was too rehearsed, too clean. It was the same dismissive tone men used when they wanted a problem to go away. And right now, she was the problem. He wouldn't have left without a word, she insisted, her voice rising. He's all the family I have. I've been searching for him for 6 months. Please, if you know anything. As she spoke, her hand instinctively went to the locket at her throat. It was a nervous habit, a way of grounding herself when the world felt like it was spinning out of control. Her fingers traced the cool, familiar silver. And John Blackwood's entire demeanor shattered. The color drained from his face. The hardness in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a raw, staggering shock. He took a half step back, as if he'd been physically struck. His gaze was fixed on the locket, his mouth slightly agape. The tough, unmovable rancher was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he'd just seen a ghost. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a choked whisper. Where did you get that? Sarah's hand tightened around the locket, her knuckles turning white. This was her last link to a life she never knew, to a mother she couldn't remember. It was my mother's, she said, her voice trembling slightly. She died when I was a child. This is all I have of her. Blackwood's hands were shaking. He looked like he was about to collapse. The ranch hands, including Pete, were watching him with wide, alarmed eyes. They had never seen their boss like this. Let me see it, he breathed, his voice ragged. Please, open it. She didn't know why, but she did. Something in his raw desperation compelled her. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the tiny clasp. It sprang open, revealing the faded photograph inside. A young woman with dark, gentle eyes holding a baby. John Blackwood made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He reached a trembling hand toward the locket, then pulled it back as if the silver had burned him. Emma, he whispered, the name a prayer and a curse. My Emma. The world tilted on its axis. The ground felt like it was falling away beneath Sarah's feet. That's impossible, she stammered. My mother's name was Emma. Emma Hayes. No, Blackwood corrected, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. He looked from the locket to her face, his eyes searching, finally seeing. Her name was Emma Blackwood. He choked on the words. She was my wife, and that baby in the photograph, is my daughter. The air rushed out of Sarah's lungs. 1,000 questions, 1,000,000 fragments of a forgotten past, crashed down on her all at once. Her mind couldn't process it. Father? Daughter? It was impossible. My parents died, she said, her voice a faint whisper. In a wagon accident. When I was 3, my aunt and uncle raised me. Their name was Hayes. John Blackwood sank onto the porch steps, bearing his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The accident, he gasped. They told me everyone was gone. Emma and my little girl. They said there were no survivors. Pete, the kind-eyed ranch hand, stepped forward, his own face pale with disbelief. Boss, are you sure? Blackwood looked up, his eyes locking on Sarah's. And for the first time she saw it. Not just the grief, but the resemblance. The same stubborn jawline, the same determined set of her mouth, the same deep, stormy eyes. I'd know Emma's eyes anywhere, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And that locket, I gave it to her on our wedding day. She had found him. After a lifetime of being an orphan, of feeling adrift in the world, she had found her father. A wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to drown her washed over her. Joy, confusion, grief, and a dawning, terrible dread. Because one question still remained. One question that suddenly felt more dangerous than ever. She took a step toward him, her entire body trembling. If you're my father, then where is Michael? Where is my brother? The brief, fragile light of reunion in John Blackwood's eyes died, extinguished by a fresh wave of pain and something else. Something that looked like guilt. He rose slowly to his feet, the weight of 15 years of grief settling back onto his shoulders. Come inside, he said, his voice heavy as a tombstone. We need to talk. There are things you need to know about your brother. Terrible things. He paused, his eyes dark with a chilling certainty. And you need to understand that by coming here, by wearing that locket, you've just put a target on your back. You're in more danger now than you have ever been in your life. He turned and walked toward the house, leaving Sarah standing in the dusty yard with the earth-shattering truth. She had found her family, and in doing so, she may have just signed her own death warrant. The inside of the house was a museum of sorrow. Dust covers draped the furniture like white ghosts, and the air was thick with the musty smell of a home where hope had died long ago. John, her father, led her into a sitting room. Over the massive stone fireplace hung a large oil-painted portrait. It was the woman from the Locket, older, her face filled with a warmth and life that the tiny, faded photograph couldn't capture. In her arms, she held a small baby girl with a shock of dark hair. That's your mother, Emma, John said, his voice soft and raw. And that's you, Sarah. Sarah stared at the painting, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She could almost feel it, a phantom memory, the ghost of a touch, the warmth of being held in those arms. It was a life stolen from her, a life she never knew she'd lost. But the ghost of her mother couldn't answer the question that was screaming in her mind. Michael, she said, her voice barely a whisper. What happened to him? You said you had to tell me something terrible. John's face hardened, the grief momentarily replaced by a cold, simmering rage. But it wasn't directed at her. It was directed inward, at himself. Your brother came here just like you did. A young man looking for work, asking questions. He paced the room like a caged animal. He was a good kid, honest, a hard worker. But he was curious. Curious about what? Sarah pressed. About the past. About what happened 15 years ago. John stopped pacing and looked her straight in the eye. He was asking about the wagon accident. He told me he'd heard rumors, stories that his little sister might have survived, that she might still be in this territory. He let out a short, bitter laugh. I didn't believe him. I thought he was a grifter, trying to play on an old man's grief. I almost sent him away. But you didn't, Sarah said. No, he had proof. Letters from the family that raised you. Documents. He wasn't lying. John's voice grew heavy with regret. And that's what got him into trouble. That's what made him a target. A cold knot of fear tightened in Sarah's stomach. A target for whom? What happened to him, John? Her father wouldn't meet her gaze. He stared out the dusty window at the dying light. There's a man in this territory named Frank Morrison. He runs things. He's got his hands in everything. Protection rackets, land grabs, mining claims. He's a cancer on this valley, and he does not like people asking questions about the past. The name Morrison meant nothing to her, but the way her father said it, with a venomous mix of hatred and fear, told her everything she needed to know. When word got out that Michael was digging into the accident, John's voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah sank into a nearby armchair, the dusty fabric scratching her skin. The room felt like it was closing in. Is he dead? She asked, the words catching in her throat. I don't know, John admitted, and the honesty of it was more terrifying than any lie. He disappeared one night about 3 months back. Just vanished. All his things were still in his bunk, but there were signs of a struggle, blood on the floorboards. The knot in her stomach twisted into a blade of ice. Michael, her brother who had spent months, maybe years, searching for her, had found the truth only to be swallowed by it. The injustice was a physical pain, a fire in her chest. She stood up, her grief solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. Who is this man? This Morrison? Why would he care about an accident from 15 years ago? John's face was a grim mask. Because Sarah, it wasn't an accident. The floor seemed to drop out from under her again. What? Your mother, Emma, she was smart. She kept meticulous records of the ranch's business. She'd found evidence that Morrison was cheating us, that he was using illegal claims to steal silver from our land. We were on our way to town that night to meet with a lawyer. We were going to expose him. The terrible, hidden history of her life was finally coming into focus, a picture of pure evil. So he had you killed. He tried, John said, his voice barely a whisper. The wagon didn't just go off the road. It was forced. A felled tree in the path, men with guns. I was thrown clear, woke up days later. They told me you and your mother were gone. They must have thought the job was done. A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a conspiracy, a massacre that had defined her entire life without her ever knowing it. And Michael found out, she breathed. I think he got close, John said grimly. Close enough that Morrison couldn't risk it. I think they took him, Sarah, and I don't know if he's still alive. In the space of an hour, she had found a father, lost her mother all over again, and learned that the brother she'd been desperately searching for had been kidnapped by the same man who had murdered their parents. It was too much. It should have broken her, but it didn't. Instead, a fire ignited in her soul, a cold, furious flame. They hadn't just taken her family. They had taken her life. They had turned her into an orphan, a drifter, a ghost haunting the edges of her own story. No more. She turned to face her father, and he saw it in her eyes. The same fire he had once seen in Emma's. The fire of a woman who would not be broken, who would not back down. Where is he? She asked, her voice low and dangerous. This Frank Morrison. Where can I find him? John looked at the daughter he had thought was dead for 15 years. She was a stranger, and yet he knew her completely. Sarah, no. These men are animals. They've killed once, maybe more. I just got you back. I will not lose you again. You won't lose me, she said, her voice ringing with unshakable certainty. But I am not leaving my brother in the hands of the man who killed our mother. Michael came here looking for me. He walked into the lion's den for me. I am going to walk in there and pull him out. The setting sun cast long, bloody shadows across the valley. She was no longer Sarah Hayes, the lonely traveler. She was Sarah Blackwood. And she was home. And she was going to war. Tell me everything, she said, her eyes locked on her father's. Tell me about Morrison, his men, his hideouts, his weaknesses. Tell me everything you know. John Blackwood looked at his daughter, at the ghost of his beloved Emma standing before him, and for the first time in 15 years, the crushing weight of despair lifted, replaced by a spark of terrifying hope. He had lost his family once to Frank Morrison. He would not let it happen again. All right, he said, a grim smile touching his lips, but we do this together. Night fell over the Blackwood Ranch, not with peace, but with the silent promise of violence. Father and daughter, separated by tragedy and reunited by vengeance, sat at the kitchen table, a hand-drawn map spread between them under the flickering lamplight. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for years was finally about to break, and Sarah Blackwood was ready to become the lightning. The plan was desperate, bordering on suicidal. John explained that Morrison was untouchable. He had the local law in his pocket. That explained Marshall Davidson and the rock slide in Devil's Jaw, and enough hired guns to make him a king in this isolated valley. He had 3 main bases of operation: an old abandoned silver mine to the south, a fortified camp up in Devil's Canyon, and a small remote line cabin he used for sensitive business. If they're holding Michael, John said, his finger tapping the map, it'll be at the line cabin. It's isolated, easy to defend, but not a fortress like his main camp. Then that's where we start, Sarah declared. But before they could ride out, she needed to know more. The ranch hands, she said. Pete, he knew Michael. He might have seen something, heard something you missed. John nodded. Good thinking. Your mother was always one step ahead, too. They found Pete in the barn. his face etched with worry in the lantern light. He had been waiting for them. He knew this conversation was coming. "Miss Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I know what you're planning. I wish I could talk you out of it, but I see your mother's stubbornness in your eyes. Pete, I need to know. Michael's last days here. Was there anything unusual?" Sarah asked, her gaze intense. Pete hesitated, glancing at John. Her father gave him a slight nod. "Tell her everything, Pete. She has a right to know." The old ranch hand took a deep breath. "He wasn't just asking about the accident, miss. He was in town a lot, at the county clerk's office, looking at land records, inheritance laws." He paused, his words heavy with significance. He was mighty interested in who had the legal claim to this ranch if something were to happen to the boss. A cold dread trickled down Sarah's spine. "You think he was planning to take it?" "No, miss," Pete said quickly. "Not at all. I think he was trying to figure out if you had a claim. If he could find you, he wanted to bring you home, to what was rightfully yours." John's face went pale. He sank onto a nearby hay bale. "That's it," he breathed. "That's why Morrison took him." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Morrison's been trying to buy this ranch for years," John explained, his voice grim. "I've refused every offer. He knows this land is rich with silver, far more than anyone realizes. But as long as I'm alive, he can't touch it. If I die with no heir, the property goes to the county, and he can scoop it up for pennies on the dollar." "But if you have an heir," Sarah finished, the horrifying logic clicking into place. "If Michael proved I was alive, that complicates Morrison's plan. It gives him a motive for kidnapping, or worse." "There's more," Pete said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The night before he disappeared, Michael came to me. He was excited. He said he'd found something. Proof. He had a letter from your aunt, confirming you were alive and heading west." "That letter is gone now, I assume," Sarah said bitterly. Pete nodded. "But he said something else. Something strange. He said he'd been having dreams about this place. Not dreams exactly. More like memories. Little girl playing in the big house. A rocking horse by the window. The air in the barn grew thick with unspoken memories. "Emma used to bring you here when you were a baby," John said softly. "You loved that rocking horse. The one that was still there. The one she had seen when she first entered the house. A piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Michael hadn't just been searching for her. He had been remembering her. He was piecing it together," Pete said. "He was getting too close to the truth of what really happened that night." "What do you mean, what really happened?" Sarah demanded. "I thought I knew." John and Pete exchanged a dark look, a shared secret that was about to be unearthed. "Miss Sarah," Pete said carefully, "that wagon wreck, it wasn't just about the silver claim. Your mother had found something else, something far more dangerous to Morrison." He took a shaky breath. "She'd found his ledger." "His ledger?" "The real one," John clarified, his eyes blazing with a 15-year-old fury. "Not the cooked books he shows the territorial government. The one that lists every bribe, every land grab, every murder. It was his entire criminal enterprise, all written down. She'd found where he kept it. That's why we were going to the lawyer, to turn over the evidence that would destroy him and his entire network all the way back east." The secret was finally out, and it was a monster. Her parents hadn't just been victims. They had been heroes on the verge of taking down a tyrant, and Morrison hadn't just covered up a murder. He'd protected an empire. "So Michael wasn't just a threat because he was my brother," Sarah realized, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. "Morrison must think he found the ledger too, or that he knew where it was. And now," John said, his voice grave, "he'll think the same about you. The line cabin wasn't just a prison for her brother. It was a trap, baited with the one thing Morrison knew she couldn't resist. We need to move. Now," Sarah said, her voice like flint. "If he thinks I know about that ledger, he won't wait. He'll kill Michael to keep him quiet, and then he'll send every man he has to hunt me down." The ride to the line cabin was a tense, silent journey through the dark, rain-slicked hills. Pete, insisting that Michael had been his friend, rode with them. 3 figures against an army. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke, lashing the landscape with furious wind and rain. The thunder was a drumbeat, counting down the seconds to the inevitable confrontation. They left their horses in a thicket and approached the cabin on foot, using the storm as cover. It was a small, dark shape huddled against the pines, a single plume of smoke rising from its chimney, instantly torn apart by the wind. A lone guard sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his collar turned up against the rain. Two horses were tied to a post nearby. Cal Hendricks, John whispered, his mouth close to Sarah's ear. Vicious, loyal to Morrison. One outside means at least two more inside, Pete added. Standard practice. They crept around to the back, the mud sucking at their boots. A single grimy window offered a view into a small back room. John peered through it, then motioned for Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Michael. He was tied to a chair, his face bruised and swollen, his clothes torn. But he was alive. His head was bowed, but she could see the slow rise and fall of his chest. Relief warred with a white-hot rage that threatened to consume her. She looked at her father. His face was a mask of cold fury. Two more, he mouthed silently, playing cards at a table in the main room. 3 guards, 3 of them. They were outnumbered. A straight assault was suicide. We need a distraction, Sarah whispered. Draw the man on the porch away from the door. I'll do it, Pete said before John could object. I can circle around, make a sound in the woods on the far side. It'll pull Hendricks off the porch to investigate. That's your window. You two go through the back. When you hear 3 owl hoots, that's my signal. That means Hendricks is gone, and you have a clear shot. It was a good plan, a simple plan, but simple plans have a way of going horribly wrong. Pete melted into the rainy darkness. Sarah and her father took their positions beneath the window, rifles ready, their hearts pounding in time with the hammering rain. The seconds stretched into an eternity. They waited for the signal, for the 3 owl hoots that would mean their chance had come, and then they heard it. Not an owl hoot, a single deafening gunshot echoing from the front of the cabin. Something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Now! John yelled over the roar of the storm. There was no more time for stealth. They smashed through the window in a shower of rotten wood and broken glass, landing in a crouch on the splintered floorboards. The 2 men in the main room were already on their feet, their card games scattered, guns being drawn. They were expecting trouble, but not from behind. The man on the right was a fraction of a second too slow. Sarah's rifle bucked against her shoulder, the shot deafening in the small space. He staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing over the table. The second man was faster. He got a shot off, the bullet splintering the wall just past John's head. But her father was already moving, his revolver barking twice. The man crumpled to the floor. Silence save for the storm and their own ragged breaths. Sarah! Michael's voice was hoarse but strong. He was staring at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and a fierce protective pride. How did you... Later, she said, rushing to his side and sawing at his ropes with her knife. Are you hurt? I'll live, he grunted as the ropes fell away. He stood, rubbing his chafed wrists. Pete, that gunshot... His question was answered by a cold, familiar voice from the front doorway. He's not going to be a problem anymore. They spun around. Cal Hendricks stood there, silhouetted against the stormy darkness. His rifle was leveled, not at them, but at the man he held in front of him like a shield. It was Pete. His face was bloody, and his eyes were full of apology. Now, Hendricks said with a nasty grin, his teeth yellow in the lamplight. I think you folks are going to put those weapons down. Real slow. They were caught. The rescue had been a failure. The trap had been sprung. John raised his hands, his revolver held loosely. Don't do this, Cal. It's over. Oh, it's just getting started, Hendricks sneered. See? The boss, Mr. Morrison, he's been real curious to meet the whole Blackwood family, especially the daughter he thought was long dead. His eyes locked on Sarah, gleaming with a predatory light. Finding you saves us a whole lot of trouble. The boss has big plans, and a living heir just messes up the paperwork. So you'll just murder us all in cold blood? Michael challenged, stepping in front of Sarah. Murder's such an ugly word, Hendricks said. Let's call it an Accident. A terrible tragedy. Father and his long-lost children reunited for a day, only to be caught in a cabin fire during a storm. Who'd question it? Sarah's mind was racing, searching for an out, an angle, anything. But there was none. They were trapped, outgunned. Pete's life was on the line. Her fingers brushed against the hilt of the knife still tucked in her belt. A desperate last-ditch play. Of course, Hendricks continued, enjoying his moment of power. The boss is a reasonable man. Sign over the deed to the ranch, and maybe, just maybe, he lets the girl walk away. After all, she's got no claim if the land ain't in the family name no more. Never, John snarled. That land is my children's birthright. Wrong answer, Hendricks said, and his finger tightened on the trigger. In that split second, time seemed to slow down. Sarah saw the flicker in Hendricks's eyes, the tightening of his knuckle. She saw Pete brace for the impact. Her hand moved in a blur. The knife left her fingers, spinning end over end through the air, a flash of deadly silver in the lamplight. It struck Hendricks high in the shoulder, burying itself to the hilt. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain, and his rifle shot went wide, blasting a hole in the ceiling. He staggered back, his grip on Pete loosening for just a second. It was all the time they needed. Pete slammed his elbow back into Hendricks's jaw. John's revolver roared, the bullet hitting Hendricks square in the chest. He collapsed in the doorway like a puppet with its strings cut, his dead eyes staring up at the raging storm. It was over, for a moment. We need to go, Sarah said, grabbing her rifle. He said Morrison was expecting him. When he doesn't show up, they'll send more men. She's right, Michael agreed, finding a pistol on one of the dead men and checking its load. We can't go back to the ranch. They'll be watching it. Then where do we go? John asked, reloading his own weapon. As if in answer, Pete, clutching his wounded head, stumbled back into the cabin. He was holding something he'd pulled from Hendricks's body, a small oilskin-wrapped package. I heard them talking before they got the drop on me, Pete gasped. Hendricks was bragging, said Morrison was moving his main operation tonight. He unwrapped the package. Inside was a map, nearly identical to the one John had, but with fresh markings on it. One location was circled in red ink, the abandoned silver mine, the place John had said was for people who wouldn't be coming back. He's clearing out his other camps, Michael said, his eyes scanning the map. Consolidating his forces, he's planning something big, something final. And he'll have his whole army there, John said grimly. It's a fortress. Good, Sarah said, her voice chillingly calm. She took the map from Pete. Then we won't have to hunt them down one by one. Her father and brother stared at her as if she were insane. Sarah, listen to me, John pleaded. There must be 30 men there. We're only 3 and Pete's wounded. 4, Pete grunted, tying a strip of cloth around his head. And I can still shoot. She's right, Dad, Michael said, a new fire in his eyes. He looked at Sarah, a deep, unspoken understanding passing between them. They were siblings, forged in the same fire of loss and tragedy. And now they would either find justice together or die together. We can't run, not anymore. Everything he's ever done, everyone he's ever hurt, the answers are in that mine. The ledger, it has to be there. Sarah looked at the 3 men standing with her in the blood-soaked cabin, surrounded by the dead. Her father, the grieving ghost, her brother, the avenging survivor, and Pete, the loyal friend. This was her army. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Morrison thinks we're running, she said, her gaze fixed on the map, on the circled red X that marked their destiny. He thinks we're scared. He's expecting us to hide. She looked up, her eyes blazing with the force of a wildfire. He's not expecting us to attack. They rode through the heart of the storm, 4 ghosts on a mission of vengeance. The rain washed the blood from their clothes but couldn't cleanse the fury from their hearts. The silver mine was carved into the side of a barren mountain, a gaping black maw that seemed to swallow the very light around it. A network of rough wooden buildings, a barracks, a cookhouse, an office, clung to the mountainside around the entrance. Lights blazed in the windows, and the sounds of rough laughter and drunken shouting carried on the wind. Morrison's army was celebrating. They thought they had already won. From a rocky outcrop overlooking the camp, Sarah, John, Michael, and Pete watched. They counted over 24 men, all heavily armed. Sentries were posted at the mine entrance and on the roof of the largest building. It was, as John had said, a fortress. "There's no way in," John said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "They'll see us coming a mile off." "A direct assault is impossible," Michael agreed. "We'd be cut down before we got within 100 yards. Sarah said nothing. She wasn't looking at the guards or the guns. She was looking at the mountain itself, at the way the rock was structured, at the old half-collapsed shafts and ventilation holes that dotted the cliff face like forgotten scars. Her mother had kept records. Her father had run this land. And Michael had been doing research. "You said he was looking at old records," Sarah said, turning to Pete. "Land surveys, mining claims. Did he ever mention old schematics? Blueprints of this mine?" Pete's eyes widened slightly. "Now that you mention it, he was looking at some old territorial maps from before the mine was even active. Said he was looking for aeration shafts?" "Ventilation shafts," Michael corrected, his voice electric with a sudden realization. They would have dug them all over the mountain to keep the air flowing in the main tunnels. Most of them would be collapsed now, but maybe... He pulled a crumpled, dog-eared piece of paper from his pocket, a hand-drawn copy of a map he had made during his research. He flattened it on a rock, and the four of them huddled around it. "There," Michael whispered, his finger tracing a faint dotted line. "An old access tunnel. A secondary entrance used for hauling out tailings. It's on the far side of the mountain. It was sealed up 50 years ago. Morrison probably doesn't even know it exists. It was their only chance. A sliver of hope in a mountain of impossibility." They spent the next hour working their way around the mountain, climbing over treacherous, rain-slicked rock, the storm their only ally, masking their sounds. They found the entrance exactly where Michael's map said it would be. It was covered by a rock slide, but a small, dark opening, barely big enough for a man to crawl through, was visible at the base. "Pete, you stay here," John commanded. "You're in no shape for this. If we're not back by dawn, you ride. You get out of this valley and you don't look back." The old ranch hand looked like he wanted to argue, but he saw the resolve in their faces. He simply nodded, his hand resting on the shotgun at his side. "Give 'em hell, boss." One by one, they slipped into the darkness of the mountain. The tunnel was tight, filled with the smell of damp earth and stale, dead air. They moved in silence, their only light coming from a small oil lamp Michael had shielded with his hand. The tunnel twisted and turned, descending deep into the earth. Several times they came to collapsed sections and had to dig their way through, their hands raw, their muscles screaming in protest. After what felt like an eternity, they heard it, the faint sound of voices echoing through the rock. They had reached the main mine. They emerged through a narrow fissure behind a stack of old, rotting timbers into one of the main mining tunnels. The air was warmer here, and the tunnel was lit by lanterns hung from the rock walls. They could see the main cavern ahead, a massive vaulted space where most of Morrison's men were gathered around a bonfire, drinking and gambling. And in the center of it all, standing in a well-lit office carved into the rock, was Frank Morrison himself. He was talking to a well-dressed man, one of the investors from back east Michael had mentioned, but something else caught Sarah's eye. A heavy, iron-banded chest sitting on a table next to Morrison's desk. "The ledger," she breathed. Their plan was simple. John and Michael would create a diversion, a big one. They had found a stash of blasting powder and dynamite in one of the side tunnels. They would set a charge at the far end of the mine, creating a collapse that would draw most of the men away from the main cavern. In the confusion, Sarah would slip into the office and get the ledger. It was a plan that relied on timing, luck, and Morrison's men being exactly as stupid as they seemed. John clasped Sarah's shoulder, his eyes meeting hers. "Be careful, daughter." "You too, Dad," she whispered back. Then he and Michael were gone, melting back into the shadows of the tunnels. Sarah flattened herself against the cold rock wall, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched Morrison in his office, watched him laugh with the investor, a man profiting from the blood and tears of her family. The cold, focused rage returned, sharpening her senses. Steadying her hand on the rifle she carried, she waited. The explosion was catastrophic. A deafening roar echoed through the mine, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. Rock and dust rained from the ceiling of the main cavern. The bonfire sent a shower of sparks into the air as the ground trembled. Morrison's men scrambled to their feet, shouting in confusion and alarm. "It's a cave-in!" one of them yelled. "Section 4!" Just as they'd hoped, the men, led by Morrison's foreman, grabbed lanterns and pickaxes and rushed down the tunnel toward the supposed collapse, leaving only a handful of guards in the main cavern. Morrison and the investor rushed out of the office, their faces masks of concern. "What in God's name was that?" one of the investor demanded. "A tremor. It happens," Morrison said, though his eyes darted around nervously. "Go check the damage," he barked at one of the remaining guards. This was her chance. As Morrison was distracted, shouting orders, Sarah slipped from the shadows. She moved like a wraith, silent and unseen, across the cavern floor and into the now empty office. The iron chest was there. It was locked with a heavy padlock. She didn't have time to pick it. She scanned the office, her eyes falling on a heavy iron pry bar leaning against the wall. She jammed it into the lock's hasp and put all her weight on it. The metal groaned in protest. With a final, desperate heave, the hasp snapped. The chest was open, and there it was. Not just one ledger, but a stack of them. Years of meticulous records of theft, blackmail, and murder. Her mother had been right. It was all here. She grabbed the top ledger, the most recent one, and tucked it inside her shirt. And then the office door creaked open. She spun around, rifle raised. It wasn't Morrison. It was the investor, his face pale, his expensive suit covered in dust. He looked from Sarah to the open chest, to the rifle pointed at his heart. "Please," he stammered, raising his hands. "I'm just a businessman. I didn't know about any of this." "You knew," Sarah said, her voice like ice. "You knew people were dying. You just didn't care, as long as the silver kept flowing." Before she could decide what to do with him, a voice from the doorway spoke her name. "Sarah Blackwood." She turned. Frank Morrison stood there, a revolver in his hand, his cold eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and murderous rage. He had not been fooled by the diversion. "I should have known," he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Like mother, like daughter, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." He took a step into the office, the investor cowering behind him. "Give me the book, girl, and I might let you die quickly." "It's over, Morrison," Sarah said, her rifle steady. "It all ends tonight." "You're right about that," he snarled and raised his pistol. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Morrison's gun, or Sarah's. Morrison staggered, a red stain blossoming on his shoulder. He looked down at it in disbelief, then back toward the cavern. John Blackwood stood at the entrance to a side tunnel, his revolver smoking. The diversion had worked better than they'd planned. He and Michael had circled back. Morrison, in rage, fired wildly into the cavern. "Kill them!" he screamed. "Kill them all!" The few remaining guards opened fire. The office, which had been Sarah's goal, now became her prison. Bullets splintered the doorframe, ricocheting off the rock walls. The investor shrieked and dove under the desk. Sarah returned fire, using the heavy desk for cover. She could hear her father and brother shouting, their guns adding to the cacophony. The cavern had become a kill box. She risked a glance around the desk. Morrison was using the chaos to make his escape. Clutching his wounded shoulder, he was staggering toward a small private tunnel at the back of his office. An escape route. He was not getting away. She burst from the office, firing as she ran, providing cover for John and Michael. The guards were caught in a crossfire, confused, their numbers dwindling with every passing second. "Morrison's getting away!" she yelled. "Back tunnel!" Michael nodded, laying down suppressing fire while Sarah and John charged after their family's nemesis. The escape tunnel was narrow and dark, sloping steeply upwards. They could hear Morrison ahead of them, his labored breaths echoing off the wet rock. They emerged into the storm, onto a narrow ledge overlooking a sheer drop. The rain was coming down in sheets and lightning illuminated the scene in stark, terrifying flashes. Morrison was trapped. The ledge was a dead end. He turned to face them, his back to the abyss, his face a mask of cornered desperation and hatred. His fancy clothes were torn and muddy, his wounded shoulder bleeding freely. The powerful man was reduced to a wounded animal. "You Blackwoods," he spat, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. "You've been a thorn in my side from the very beginning." "You murdered my mother," John roared, his voice competing with the thunder. "You destroyed my family." "She was a threat to progress," Morrison screamed back. "This valley was meant to be mine. It was my destiny." "It's not your destiny, Morrison," Sarah said, her rifle leveled at his chest. The ledger was safe, tucked against her skin. "It's your grave." Morrison laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "You think this is the end? Even if you kill me, my associates in the East will just send more men. They'll take this land. You haven't won anything." "Maybe," Sarah said calmly, "but you won't be here to see it." She saw his eyes flicker, saw his hand tighten on his revolver. He was going to try and take one of them with him. But before he could make his move, a new voice cut through the storm. "Drop it, Morrison!" On a ledge above them, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood Marshal Tom Davidson, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were a dozen deputized townsfolk, armed with rifles and shotguns. And standing next to him, holding a shotgun with a grim look of satisfaction on his face, was Pete. He had ridden for help, after all. Morrison's face fell, the last of his bravado crumbling into dust. He looked from the guns above to the guns in front of him. He was surrounded, beaten. "It's over, Frank," the marshal said, his voice carrying surprising authority. "We know everything, Pete told us. The people of this valley are done living in fear." For a moment, it seemed like Morrison might surrender. He slowly raised his hands, and then his eyes met Sarah's. He saw not a frightened girl, but the ghost of Emma Blackwood, the woman who had almost ruined him 15 years ago. He saw his ultimate failure, and he snapped. With a final, desperate scream of rage, he lunged, not at Sarah or John, but sideways, off the ledge. He chose the abyss over justice, his scream swallowed by the storm as he tumbled into the darkness below. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind and the rain. Then slowly, John Blackwood lowered his revolver. He walked to his daughter and wrapped her in his arms, holding her tight. Michael joined them, his arm around them both. The Blackwood family, shattered and scattered for 15 long years, was finally whole again. The storm began to break as dawn approached. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the first gray light of a new day appeared on the horizon. From the mountain, Sarah could see the valley spread out below. Her valley, her home. Marshal Davidson and the townsmen rounded up Morrison's remaining men, who had surrendered without their leader. The investor was found cowering under the desk, babbling about a misunderstanding. He, along with the ledgers, would be handed over to the federal authorities. The conspiracy was broken. The reign of terror was over. Sarah, John, and Michael stood on the porch of the Blackwood Ranch, watching the sunrise. The house was damaged, the ranch was in disrepair, but it was theirs. It was their future. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Sarah," John said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah touched the silver locket at her throat. She had started this journey with nothing but a question. Now she had answers. She had a father. She had a brother. She had a home. She had found everything she was looking for, and more. It wasn't the end of their story, it was the beginning. They would rebuild the ranch, rebuild the community, and honor the memory of the woman who had sacrificed everything for them. They would build a legacy of strength, courage, and justice. The story of the Blackwood family was a reminder that even in the darkest of valleys, in the heart of the most violent storm, hope can survive. That the bonds of family are stronger than greed, and that one person's search for the truth can bring redemption to an entire land. If you enjoyed this story of justice on the frontier, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you found a secret that could take down a tyrant? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.